People who have worked out at sea, what's the creepiest thing that's happened? Story 1. So it's actually pretty common, but you'll see ghost vessels boats that are undamaged but have no souls on board, in the middle, and I mean middle of the sea. The reason for these tend to be pretty dull. They are normally people private boats they've had bad weather and snapped their lines and just drifted. Still is creepy when one goes past in the middle of the night hundreds of miles from land. Story 2. Not necessarily at sea, but I worked on a research ship in the Arctic. We were slowly pushing our way through an ice fog. A friend and I were on deck having a smoke, just watching the ice slowly float by, when a large seal laying on the ice came into view. It was obviously dead, as the skin had fallen away from its ribs, but otherwise it was perfectly persevered. Just as the seal started to disappear in the fog, a polar bear appeared, crouched as though it was stalking the seal. It was also dead. The fur on its extended front leg had fallen away, exposing the bone. Otherwise it was also perfectly persevered. Almost in unison, my friend and I look at each other and said WTF. Story 3. On a drill ship off the coast of Nigeria. One evening the entire surface of the ocean was covered with jellyfish as far as the eye could see. An hour or two later they were all gone. Story 4. Down in the Caribbean, there was a 90-foot commercial fishing vessel sitting on top of a 100 cliff where it had been tossed like a tubby toy during a hurricane. Hurricanes don't around. Story 5. You'll expect otherwise, but I've seen more people drown that I would consider reasonable. It's always the same cycle. People get overconfident and don't bother wearing protection PPE. Then one day someone slips and falls to the water. Survival depends on the weather. Port reacts like a beehive. Suddenly, everyone is hyper-aware of PPE, but 1 month later, everyone has forgotten, and no one wants to bother with the tedious process of properly fitting a life jacket, until someone falls again later and we repeat the loop. Story 6. The only time I was ever on a ship was actually a cargo ship, and it was for a program for my business class. Basically you got to shadow several people and see a product's full journey. Like I started at a farm, went to a trucking depot, then a dry goods warehouse, then a cargo yard, then finally a cargo ship to China. Can't get off the ship when it gets there, so that was the end. Then catch a ride back on another cargo ship. Trip was very informative. The creepy thing though was at 6 a.m. and the ship blades its horn. We are out somewhere in the Pacific and then slows down over the next 20 minutes. I made my way up to the guy that was doing the program and he's talking to the captain, and the captain is clearly pretty freaked out. This is the absolute middle of nowhere and there's a tiny coral island with no trees or vegetation, just a load of birds. And a cargo container next to a tent. The ship is hardly moving at this point and the captain calls out over a megaphone to see if anyone is there. After a minute a guy who's clean-shaven but wearing clothes worn to rags island, a deep tan wobbles out of the cargo container. Captain yells out if the guy needs help. He says something but they can't hear it. A guy volunteered to go out to him on an inflatable boat. He climbs down the rope, gets on the boat. Meanwhile the guy is just sitting on a bucket. He goes all the way over within 20 feet of the guy. They talk for a few minutes and he comes back, climbs the ladder, and goes to the captain. Captain asks what the guy said. Guy goes, he said he's good guy, gave no info, no plans, had no food but dried fish and some water distilling thing, is out hundreds of miles from another living person, has no boat, and says him good. Story 7-1. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, mafia welding a box full of narcotics on the vessel's hull underwater in the Caribbean, only for their friends in Northern America to retrieve them. Similar incidents have led to underwater inspections by Coast Guard divers on vessel arrivals from specific ports too. A crew member to call the bridge frantically to inform me that the sofa in the smoke room is possessed by a spirit. On closer look a stowaway had lifted the cushions in Dracula-esque manner only to try and come out, at night, once we were underway in international waters. 3. Wire rope snap during mooring operations, to then basically split a crew member into bits whom we had to then collect in bags. Traumatic to say the least. These things never leave you. 4. A crew member repeatedly removes the safety guard on a grinding disc for convenience, then for the disc to crack and impinge a shrapnel into his left eye. Agonizing screams even for days till we could reach the nearest helicopter rescue area in the Pacific. 5. Orinoco River Venezuelan Amazon interaction with indigenous tribes where we exchanged shoes, basic meds, mosquito repellent, detergent for some wild honey, fish, wild fruit which I had never seen before. Story 8. Does fishing count as working? My dad and I were fishing and thought we saw a sea turtle with its head sticking out of the water. I got our camera out back in the 90s ready to take the shot. As we got in range we realized it was a body floating belly up, arms straight up in the air. Poor guy was fishing a few days before with friends when a storm blew and capsized his boat in the Long Island Sound, anchor off the back next to engine with waves hitting the front. Flipped it, didn't get his life jacket on in time. His 3 friends made it to shore, he did not. We drove back to the marina, radio wasn't working that day and reported it. A few other boats had also reported and they were in the process of recovering the body. Story 9. We used to have to sound the fuel tanks on a Coast Guard cutter I was on, that involved going out to the decks and inserting a tape measure into tanks. If we did it at night with a flashlight, sometimes a flying fish, which were attracted to light, would jump out and smack us in the face. That was jarring. Story 10. Was traveling through Bab al-Mandeb. The sun had set about an hour before when all of a sudden we picked up 4 speedboats pacing us on radar with no running lights, and there was no moon so it was dark. We top out at 20 knots. They sped to us at around 35 to 45 and came within 6 nanometers before leaving us be. the atmosphere on board completely changed. The old man got called to the bridge and we were getting ready to call it in when they turned away and let us be. I was aboard the Maersk Carolina, which is a sister ship to the Maersk Alabama, and on the same route which got taken a year or two later. We had no armed security on board. Story 11. Out of sight of land when the water suddenly went glass smooth as the sun was setting, and a crew member got floor psychosis and was fighting to step off the back swim deck onto the floor. The surface of the ocean he was convinced was actually land. He had to be handcuffed to a bunk and force-fed Valium, and we turned back to drop him off to the nearest port while he screamed about how the boat wasn't real. If he had bolted even a few seconds earlier he would have likely died. Story 12. Maybe it's just me, but on still clear nights the stars are above you in the sky, then they are reflected beneath you in the water, and you lose the horizon and you are floating in space. You can lose yourself in that place. Story 13. We had crocodiles and sharks circling our boat at the same time while we were processing the fish and throwing the guts overboard. That wasn't necessarily creepy but was definitely exhilarating. Captain said he seen the crocs wait between the dinghy and the main boat to snap you when you hop onto the dinghy. Tropical seas are a whole different beast. Everything in that water is dangerous in some way. Story 14. Rogue waves freak me out quite a bit. Never got to see them worked in engineering, but I remember we got slapped by one beam to at like 3 a.m. and it almost threw me out of my rack, knocked a bunch of off that wasn't strapped down, almost broke our TV, and then it went right back to being pretty calm out. Everyone in my room woke up, nobody got hurt, but we all just stared at each other like WTF did that just happen. Story 15. Stepdad built and chartered 40-foot boats to go fishing in the shallow ocean and deep-sea fishing, past the continental drop-off, where you fish mahi-mahi and king mackerel and stuff. Group books a trip. Group is remembering a deceased friend who wants his ashes spread in the deep sea. They leave the docks. Once land disappeared, a small black cloud formed above their boat. It got bigger and bigger, darker and louder, but it only stayed above their boat. Blue skies around, but above their boat was a very dark and pissed-off cloud. The cloud follows them, thundering, making equipment go haywire 20 years ago, for what it's worth. My stepdad said, "We are here. Throw this angry mother over." They spread his ashes, he said. The minute they spread his ashes, the thundering stopped, and within 5 minutes, the sky was perfectly clear. He is not one to believe in spooky stuff, but he said I had no explanation other than that son of a was pissed off about being dead. Story 16. Not me, but a guy I worked with. He was dive harvesting in an area where a boat had gone down recently. People were lost. As he moved along the bottom, he saw ahead what looked like the shape of a man in oil-slick rain gear. Reluctantly, he moved ahead. As he got closer, he saw the bib, pants, boots, and jacket laid out on the ocean floor as if a man was just lying there, preparing himself for the worst. He came within touching distance and they were empty. Story 17. Heavy seas during a storm on the flight deck. When you see real waves and feel how insignificant you are in the ocean makes for a surreal experience. One wrong step and there is literally no rescue. Now imagine you need to be along the side of the ship pulling up heavy metal fences while the ship is bouncing around like a springboard up and down, side to side all at the same time. Oil-slick tarmac glides like butter, so you better pray you got the right boots on. Not going to lie, I had to tap out momentarily and readjust before I went out again. It was definitely an experience, man. It's creepy because after one liftoff you wait around for the next sortie, and you can feel the ship getting thrown around, crashing reverberations through the flight hangar and residual oil from prior pre-flight maintenance that you're almost always going to walk into. Was on a large ferry in the middle of a cyclone. Waves were washing over top of the third deck. All crew and passengers were in life jackets just in case. Not that it would have done much good at point if we'd had to abandon ship. Waves ended up breaking some windows and the lower decks got a pretty good soaking. But other than a few scrapes and bruises and brown stains, we made it to port. Story 18. My father was in the Navy in the late 70s. His carrier was traveling through the Bermuda Triangle, heading for the Mediterranean. He was on the flight deck one night when all power on the ship suddenly died. Even people's watches stopped working, apparently. About this time he and other sailors noticed two lights in the distance, unmoving and about 100 feet above the water. The lights were visible for several minutes before they disappeared. My father didn't see them disappear, but others swore they saw the lights quickly descend into the water. In any case, after the lights disappeared, the power returned to the ship. My father doesn't believe in UFOs, stories about the Bermuda Triangle, or anything else supernatural. Well, he does wish that Bigfoot was real, but to this day he has no explanation for what happened. All he knows is that in those few minutes he experienced a strange sense of accepted dread that he's never felt before or since. There was a time where I thought he was just bullshitting us kids, even though he isn't that kind of guy. But when I was a teen he had a mini reunion with some of his old Navy buddies and they talked about it, even getting into a debate about whether it was aliens or some sort of secret military tech being tested. Story 19. My cousin worked on prawn trawlers in the Gulf of Carpentaria off North Queensland for 3 years in the 80s. Really good money but hard work when they would stay at sea for weeks offloading into a mothership. The last season they returned to port with one less crew than they left with. The official story was he was washed overboard in a storm. Took over 10 years before my cousin admitted the bloke was in that regularly picked fights, but made the mistake of pulling a knife on an old sailor. They tipped him overboard. Captain announced that the work would be a bit harder but they would get the dead guy's share in the pay. Story 20. I spent a summer on a fish processing vessel about 23 of the way out on the Aleutian Island chain in Alaska. most of the way to Russia. We were buying fish from a large tender, and some of the older hands on my processor boat were grumbling. I asked why and they told me a story. Turns out the year before, there'd been a fire on the boat I was serving on, and this fire occurred while they were tied up to the same tender we were buying fish from right now. When the guys on the tender saw smoke coming up from our boat, they took axes and cut the lines instead of getting our guys onto their boat. A fire at sea is one of the worst things imaginable. Those pricks cut our boat loose without rescuing any of the crew. A year later, my bosses were still doing business with them. If I was in charge, I would have told them to go screw. Nobody on my processor boat was hurt, but it could have gone the other way very easily. And the guys on the tender would have just watched it happen. Oh, probably would have called into the Coast Guard, but otherwise best of luck. It speaks to the intense greed of the commercial fishing industry. Story 21. I worked on a dive boat that took customers out for the weekend. Someone has to pick up the lights after the night dive. I've been alone on the sea floor 100 miles offshore in 100 feet of water with just some flashlights and a 19-cuffed spare tank. It's creepy to hear the stuff that isn't in your light cone. Also dozens of barracuda in a school when I dove off the sundeck dove as in diving board type dive. Not scuba. When about 20 feet below surface surrounded by them, we would also occasionally spearfish for lionfish under the rigs and make ceviche. I had my trap full and 2 on the spear with a nurse shark chasing me back to the boat. I missed that job. Edit. I had a regular tank as well, but no buddy, just the spare pony bottle. Story 22. My grandfather worked as a Navy cook and he flat out refused to eat shrimp, crab and any bottom feeder after working at the sea. He always said that whenever something dies, they're the first to start scavenging. It made me wonder what exactly he saw getting eaten by them that made him so viscerally sickened by the idea of eating any of their kind. Story 23. I was working in a pearl boat for around 18 months on the Arafura Sea a few years ago, and one of my roles was keeping watch in the wheelhouse. Essentially, you make sure the boat is following the preset path on the navigation, and if it strays you turn in manually to keep it within the course set. My watch was 4 to 8 a.m. About 7 a.m. I noticed a white cube perhaps 200 m port side, hard to say with no point of reference, but it didn't show up on the Navradar system we had that let you recognize boats. It was also not bobbing up and down with the waves. It was just sat there on the waterline in the distance. I got a better look at it with the binoculars, and it was so strange seeing this white cube just sat still there on the sea in the distance. It wasn't really hovering above it, but as the waves moved with the ocean every now and again I could see the bottom of it, which is how I know it was a cube. Again, it's hard to say without a point of reference at sea, but I'm guessing it was the size of a van. I'm purely going off how big things appear in the binoculars. When looking at things I do know how big they are. The person who was following my shift came to drop me a coffee, and he saw it too, so I know it wasn't just me being tired. Following this a few years later, I saw when the Tic Tac videos came out from the Pentagon, and some of the fighter pilots said they saw 5 shaped objects floating in the sky. Story 24. I was with my grandfather fishing off the coast of Oregon. A whale surfaced under us and lifted the whole 50 boat out of the water. A big black eye was looking right at us. Grandpa reached over and petted it. I about passed out. Story 25. Fall of 01, USS Philippine Sea. We were heading home across the Atlantic chasing a hurricane. 4 days of 15-20 pitch and 20 to 30 rolls. The whole ship smelled of puke. The bow would go underwater. Not just a big splash but underwater. If you went to the forward part of the ship you could go up and down ladder wells in one step. If you timed it right. Because the pitching was so great the counter-rotating screws would make the back of the ship shake like an earthquake when they got near the surface. Story 26. This wasn't even out at sea. It was on a small coastal town about 30 miles north of Boston. There's a point off the main beach of this town that features a curved line of rocks extending into the ocean. It's sort of a quarter moon crescent-shaped formation. Theta doesn't extend into the water more than 25, maybe 30 feet at the most. However, there's an underwater cliff and the depth of the water at the furthest point out is deep enough that you can't get to the bottom with specialized scuba gear, as in regular scuba diving equipment isn't enough. Something to keep in mind: if it isn't low tide, you can't get to this point without getting your legs wet, about up to your knees. So a handful of us are out there on the furthest point. It's a popular spot for locals to saltwater fish. I just watching the fishermen and doing nothing but enjoying the experience when I hear a fisherman give a soft but defeated "oh." It's difficult to describe, because "oh" isn't typically associated with a terrified reaction, but you could hear the absolute overwhelming duress in his voice, like it was quiet because he couldn't catch his breath well enough to say more or say it louder. I turned to look and there was this sea creature that was bigger than a bus, with fierce Jurassic Park-esque spots that were so close together they looked like stripes on first look. This thing was about 3 feet from the rock and riding right on top of the water. The most terrifying part was its mouth. It was big enough to swallow a sedan whole, and its teeth, they didn't even seem like real teeth. They were like a sci-fi horror uni teeth in which the top and bottom were connected along the sides of its gargantuan mouth. I fully understood the first fisherman to spot it being unable to give more than an almost delicate "oh," as this didn't look like anything I'd ever even heard of before. This was monster from outer space. But this wasn't a movie. It was right there in the water in front of me. I half expected someone to pop out of the back of the thing and scream April Fool, as it didn't seem possible such a creature really existed. Turns out, it was baskin shark, giant, fierce looking, but it's a plankton-eating gentle giant. I'd heard the name before, but never so much as seen a picture of a baskin, and I guess neither did most of the other people there. For a few moments, We all stood there terrified, wondering what in the name of Alien versus Predator was going to happen to us. Finally, one of the older fishermen on the rock informed us what it was, and assured us we were in no danger. I believed him, but was still trembling for the rest of the night. Story 27. Another one, USS McInerney off the coast of Ecuador somewhere. Our helo was out looking for drug boats, so we are all on the flight deck getting some sun, fishing or generally not doing anything. Suddenly the ship's engines stop and everything shuts down. Good thing it was smooth as glass that day. About 20 minutes later, I noticed the helo doing the lost comm signaling. It wasn't just the engines that died, it was everything. Story 28. When I was in the Navy, we were just off the coast of Italy at midnight. It was dark night, and you couldn't see any lights from the shore at all, no stars. At some point we passed a long boat, basically an extended rowboat. It had no superstructure or anything, it had a light on. Ship's captain told us that that was a guy fishing, and the light would attract fish or whatever. So yes, whoever it was in a completely exposed boat about 10 or 12 miles offshore in a completely dark night, and they had a light on to attract things. Story 29. I had a humpback whale surface on the side of the race yacht I was delivering up East Coast Australia. I rub along him and it caused 100k in gel coat damage. He blew his blowhole and I got covered in whale snot. Well, stink water anyway. Story 30. Did not see it, but I'll never forget this comment when this question floats around again. Pumping deadheads, I couldn't find it. But there's another comment on one of these posts about someone in a sailboat seeing one just miss them while they were tearing along at night. Edit found it. Story 31. I saw the Deepwater Horizon on fire the night it happened. I guess I wouldn't call it creepy. Sobering and awesome original definition are more accurate descriptions. Just a massive structure completely covered in flames against a black backdrop. We weren't allowed closer than a mile or so IRC. I can't imagine what that would have looked and felt like from up close. Story 32. We sailed the Suez. I was working on a cruise ship. The crew was paid more to do pirate watch. We watched the sea with simple night vision stuff all night. This was say 10 years ago. The wealthy guests might have paid 1 to 3 more for the cruise, but they expected the entire crew to die battling pirates so they wouldn't have to get up out of their chair. The mindset was so sick. They wanted you to die for them, but they also wanted to witness it, or else they had not gotten value for money. Story 33. Not a worker, but when I was younger my family took a trip to the Florida Gulf. A couple cousins and I went deep sea fishing about 20-30 miles off the coast. I got horrendously seasick and was bench-ridden the whole time and was taking a nap. When I finally woke up, a storm had started to roll in. I remember looking out at the back of the boat and seeing the sky turning an ominous dark gray and the water just turned black. The waves were starting to get pretty intense and the captain was all right, we really need to get back before this gets to a point where we can't. I never liked open water and that experience just made it all the worse. Story 34. I have only had one 2-week stint working at sea. I was assisting a featured chef on a theme cruise. 8 days into this 2-week adventure, I wake up running down a hallway. In my dream, I was chasing someone. I can't recall who or why. I was barefoot, in pajamas, with no bra, ID, or room card. I was embarrassed AF going to the guest services desk to request a new room card. For context, I have been known to talk in my sleep, but I have never sleepwalked before or since. Story 35. Response to the Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. The debris fields of people's lives washed out to sea, roofs of houses, sheds, furniture, picture frames, overturned boats, everyday items, just adrift, knowing that over 15,000 people were washed out to sea. Eerie. Story 36. I worked on a scallop boat and someone dredged up a half-decomposed shark. That was the day I learned that a half-decomposed shark's head looks concerningly like a human torso at first glance. The snout had rotted away to resemble a pelvis, and the way the gills were exposed looked completely like a set of ribs from a distance. It was great relieving to see that it wasn't, but on that same trip I heard some crewmates talking about the boat they knew discovering a human head and being investigated thoroughly after coming to port. Story 37. Not me, but my husband always talks about the time he was a deckhand on a NOAA research boat when he was young and spry. One time while on station in the Antarctic Circle with a cable thousands of feet in the water, their boat listed rolled 42 degrees. Fortunately, no one went overboard or was injured. Makes my butthole pucker just thinking about it. Story 38. You probably should have added a serious tag to this thread. Redditors are annoyingly immature and perpetually 12, so you'll get a lot of nonsense answers and bad jokes. Story 39. My dad was in a small flotilla of minesweepers in WW2, off the coast of Iceland. They were in the middle of a sweep. They passed a downed and floating German aircraft, with a pilot frantically waving to them for rescue. They had to sail right past and leave him to his fate, because of the very real possibility of U-boats. Fast forward 65 years, and my dad wept on his deathbed about leaving the poor guy to die in the icy Atlantic waters. Story 40. Besides the odd whale breaching, the horrible realization that there's no 5G or Wi-Fi the next 4 weeks crossing an ocean is mind-boggling. After a while you even start talking to your other crew members. Creepy stuff, nightmare material. Story 41. To 5 fires, 1 death, 3 men overboard, rescued 2 deaths by natural causes, cleared out the food freezer to put the bodies in until we reached port, rescued 11 men in a lifeboat whose ship sank days earlier, rescued 4 crew of a helicopter that crashed in the water, got caught in 2 typhoons that beat the out of our ships. Another typhoon broke all our mooring lines in port and threw our ship across the harbor to slam into the dock. just missed getting slammed by the 2004 tsunami. By a few hours, stowaways from East Africa will hide anywhere. You can never find all the crazy places they hide. They come out after a couple days at sea asking for food and water, and thinking they are home free with us. They don't realize our next port call is not the USA but another African nation that will arrest them and beat the out of them in jail. Just missed being the ship the Captain Phillips pirates took by a few miles. The Maersk Alabama was on our radar just ahead of us. I shared a stateroom with a guy who killed his dad with an axe at 14 years old. The captain didn't tell me until 2 days before we got back to port. There was a fire axe on the bulkhead right outside our stateroom. Saw 2 ghosts on 2 different ships that had confirmed deaths on board and were seen by several other people. Story 42. About 75 miles off the coast of Maine on foot sailboat. No wind at all, just fog so thick we could barely see the bow and dead silent. Suddenly there's a disturbance in the water to the side. A giant series of bubbles and the boat lists and starts sliding into the bubbles. It lasted just a few seconds but stopped as quickly as it started. We tried convincing ourselves it was just a whale bubble fishing. Didn't really work. Out tuna fishing about 170 miles off the Oregon coast one night. Had shut down and was just about to go to bed. Noticed an odd glowing orb the size of a football down in the water. Thought it was a bioluminescent jellyfish until it started moving. No swimming motion, just slowly cruising around the boat. Had a million candle power spotlight on board, so brought it out to see what it might be. But when I put the light on it, it fully disappeared. Turned the lights off and there it was, plain as day. A few more showed up and moved around the boat for about 20 minutes. Never saw a trace of what they were in the light, but my crewman and I were seeing the same thing. They eventually left and we went to bed. My crewman was an old salty dog. Sailed from Vancouver Island to the South Pacific and back single-handed twice. Worked on many tuna boats all over the Pacific. Said had never seen anything like it. Story 43. Prior Navy here. Saw a few intense things during that time, but this was afterwards doing a security job. Navy stuff is mostly just injuries and stuff like that. You'll start by saying I'm not a superstitious person, not religious, don't believe aliens are here on Earth or anything like that. I'm a game designer and engineering master's degree student. I believe in what can be proven through science, but maybe believe science hasn't explained everything yet. Empirically it hasn't explained everything yet, but I have no worldly explanation for this story. The post was basically a firewatch, stay up all night, do rounds to make sure the ship doesn't sink or catch fire. Ship was in port for a major overhaul. They had completely ripped out the wiring and the old all-hands PA system for modernization. The old one was your typical megaphone-looking loudspeakers mounted to bulkheads throughout the ship. The loudspeakers themselves were still attached to the walls, but the wiring was literally cut and the system itself was completely gone. Around 3 a.m. one night I heard the all-hands whistle, imagine your typical bosun whistle, and then some mumbling like someone was trying to talk through the speakers. I was a little confused because I could clearly see the cut wires and I knew I was alone on the ship, but I chalked it up to possibly interference in the magnetic speakers picking up radio waves or something like that. On my next rounds I discovered a shipyard worker had left a soldering iron on and it had practically melted a hole in the deck, not a fire, but a bright red spot and some smoking. I called it in and it was handled by the shipyard damage control people. In the morning when the crew arrived I was discussing it with a member of the crew assigned to be the OD for the day. When he asked if anything else had happened overnight, I casually brought up the weird experience with the loudspeaker incident as a joke. He responded completely deadpan that it was the former XO of the ship who apparently dropped dead at the intercom station. He said they'd experienced it a few times before, and it always preceded some kind of incident that could have gotten a crew member injured or endangered the ship. I wasn't sure if he was messing with me or if this was just typical sailor superstition that I've experienced before, so I was just polite about it and acted surprised impressed. Fast forward a few shifts later and I get the whistle and weird crackling again, so out of pure paranoia I decide to start my next rounds early. Sure enough, the seawater coolant system in the engine room is leaking into the compartment. Not a large leak, but if left unchecked who knows what damage could have been done. About a year later I ran into that same officer and he told me the captain had requested the old loudspeakers be left up even though they were disconnected. He said Head left the crew shortly after those incidents so he wasn't aware of any new cases. I've never had anything like this happen before or since, but I still think about it all the time. I keep telling myself there's a logical explanation and it's just a weird coincidence, but I can't shake the eerie feeling from it all. Story 44. Been on many fishing boats in the middle of the Atlantic. No real scary stories, but just seeing nothing but black abyss in every direction is pretty surreal. Story 45. I have posted a few here before. I worked on research vessels for about 15 years. This is going to get lost in the middle of the comments, but that's probably for the best. This isn't some made up about ghosts and ghouls and mysterious lights and sea monsters. On its own, it's not that scary, but the implications are. We were doing a project in the British Virgin Islands. It was subcontracted by the Royal Navy, so I can't tell you what it was now. It was about 2 weeks into this 6-week project when we saw something floating on the surface of the water. At first we thought it was a seal or a shark or dolphin. We had found one a week before, caught in illegal fishing nets, so one of the crew hauled it up. It wasn't marine life. It was a girl about 11 or 12 years old, naked, dead, and had been for at least a day. Almost immediately the captain came over screaming and yelling at us to toss her back. He was terrified. This was a brave man with 30 years spent at sea. He had guided ships through storms, sailed across oceans. even spent 2 days on a lifeboat after his fishing boat sunk, so he wasn't someone to be scared lightly, but this dead girl terrified him. We were a small crew, only 8 of us. There was the captain, a handful of older experienced hands, the chief researcher who was this British guy in his 60s, then me, a female about my age and then a younger intern. The British guy started to argue and the captain got in his face, squaring up to him shouting stuff like you do not want to mess with this, you do not want to touch this. We didn't see her. He wasn't angry, he was terrified. Whilst we were arguing, one of the other crew threw the girl back into the water. A dead 11-year-old girl, and he just tossed her back overboard. At this point the captain calmed down somewhat. He refused to tell us what was going on but just kept saying trust me, we do not want to get involved with this. Afterwards, me and the intern and the other researcher my age were talking about it. The intern spotted what I didn't. The girl had ropes around her hands and deep cuts on her ankles caused by rope. Some had tied her up, weighed her down and thrown her overboard. I'm guessing the rope around her legs snapped or came loose or wasn't tied properly. Now, at first I thought this was something cartel or gang related, and the captain knew that and that is why he was so scared. But a few years later the news about Epstein Island broke, which made me reconsider. What if Epstein Island wasn't the only one? What if there is another out there? And if there is? Considering we fished a murdered girl out of the water, it's even worse.